I am Margaret, and I am telling this story with hands that no longer stop shaking even when the house is quiet. People in my neighborhood once called me lucky. They said I had a good husband, a successful son, and a calm old age waiting gently at the end of the road. I believed that too. For more than 30 years I believed it without question. Walter and I lived in a modest white house on a tree-lined street outside Dayton, Ohio. Nothing fancy, nothing dramatic, just a place where seasons changed slowly and people waved politely from their lawns. Walter was 68, then tall for his age, still straight-backed, still speaking with the kind of careful courtesy that made people trust him instantly. I was the quiet one, the woman who cooked, who watered the plants, who smiled and listened more than she spoke. Our only son, Evan, was everything we had poured our lives into. He studied hard, left town, built a career as a civil engineer, and married Claire, a soft-spoken woman with pale eyes and a gentle laugh. They bought a small home 2 blocks from ours, close enough for Sunday dinners, but far enough to feel independent. Evan traveled often for work, long weeks away, inspecting bridges and construction sites across different states. Claire stayed behind alone most of the time, and I pitied her in that polite, distant way older women sometimes do when they see youth mixed with loneliness. At first nothing felt wrong. Walter offered to help them with small repairs when Evan was gone. A leaky faucet, a stubborn window, a flickering porch light. He always said it was what fathers did. I even felt proud watching him take his toolbox and walk down the street like a man still needed. I told myself that age should never mean uselessness. But habits change before disasters announce themselves. Walter started leaving more often and staying longer. He chose afternoons instead of mornings. He lingered in front of the mirror before going out, smoothing his hair, adjusting his shirt, pressing his collar flat. One afternoon I noticed the smell. A faint, sharp cologne he had not worn in years. I asked him about it casually, and he laughed, saying an old man should not smell like dust. His laugh came too fast. There were other things too small to accuse, yet too heavy to ignore. He returned home lighter, somehow whistling softly, setting his keys down with care instead of tossing them. When I spoke, he sometimes did not hear me the first time. When I asked what he fixed, he gave answers that floated vague and unfinished. A hinge, a handle, something loose. Always something. I tried to silence my thoughts. After all, what kind of woman suspects her husband at this age? What kind of mother imagines harm growing so close to her child? Yet at night when the house slept, I lay awake, counting the hours Evan was gone and the minutes Walter was away. The fear did not scream. It whispered. I told myself I was being foolish. I told myself that a peaceful life does not collapse without warning. I told myself smiles still meant safety. I was wrong. The day Evan called to say he would be out of state for nearly 2 weeks arrived with a strange stillness in the air. His voice sounded cheerful and distracted the way it always did when work pulled him away from home. He spoke about deadlines, inspections, hotels, and highways. I answered with the right words, the practiced ones a mother uses to hide worry. When the call ended, I stood in the kitchen holding the phone long after the screen went dark, feeling a weight settle in my chest that I could not explain. That afternoon Walter announced he would go check on the house while Evan was gone. He said it quickly, already slipping his jacket on, already reaching for his keys. He did not ask if I wanted to come or if I needed anything. He simply said it was safer that someone be there. As he spoke, he avoided my eyes. That was when I knew my doubts were no longer imagination. Something inside me hardened quietly. I waited 10 minutes after the door closed. I did not plan it. My body moved before my mind agreed. I grabbed a light coat, stepped outside, and followed the path I had walked 100 times before. The neighborhood felt unfamiliar, as if I were trespassing in my own life. Each step echoed too loudly. I kept my distance, watching Walter's back as he walked with certainty toward my son's house. He did not hesitate at the gate. He did not knock. I stood across the street pretending to examine a mailbox, while my heart beat so hard I feared it would betray me. The house was silent. No sounds of tools, no voices, no music. Minutes passed, stretching painfully long. The windows remained still. I told myself to leave, to go home, to forget this moment forever. But my feet refused. I crossed the street slowly. The front door was not locked. That detail alone made my hands tremble. Inside the house the air was dim, heavy with stillness. I stepped onto the cool floor, listening to my own breathing. I called Walter's name softly once. There was no answer. Then I heard it. Laughter, low and hushed, coming from the bedroom down the hall. A sound that did not belong in my son's home. My legs felt weak as I walked closer, each step stealing something from me I would never get back. The bedroom door was partly open. Light spilled through the gap. I pushed it. What I saw did not register at once. My mind rejected it the way the body rejects poison. Then reality forced itself forward. Walter, my husband, stood beside the bed, and Claire was there too, frozen in shock, her face drained of color. The room smelled of familiar things: my son's sheets, my son's space, violated beyond repair. A sound escaped my throat, but it did not become a scream. My vision blurred. I remember turning away, stumbling down the hall and out the door into the daylight, gasping as if I had been underwater too long. I did not look back. I ran until my lungs burned and my heart felt ready to split. Behind me I heard my name, once faint and desperate. I did not stop. I do not remember how I got home that day. I remember the door. I remember my hands fumbling with the lock like they belonged to someone else. I remember sinking to the floor of the bedroom and pressing my back against the door as if that thin piece of wood could keep the world out. My chest hurt in a way I had never known before, not sharp, not sudden, but crushing, slow and absolute. I did not scream. I did not sob. The tears came silently, sliding down my face and soaking into the collar of my dress, while my mouth stayed open, unable to form a sound. Time lost its meaning. It could have been minutes or hours before I heard footsteps. Walter's voice followed soon after, knocking, calling my name again and again. Each time he spoke it felt like something inside me tore further. When he tried the handle and realized the door was locked, his voice broke. He said he could explain. He said it was not what it looked like. He said words that meant nothing because truth had already shown itself without asking permission. He slid down outside the door. I could hear it in the way his breathing changed. He cried. I had not seen that man cry in years. He said he was weak. He said he felt old and invisible and foolish. He said Claire was lonely and that nothing had been planned. He swore it had happened only a few times. He swore it would never happen again. Each sentence felt rehearsed yet desperate, like a confession shaped by fear rather than regret. I stayed silent through the night. I did not open the door. I listened to his voice fade into hoarse whispers and finally into nothing. When morning light crept through the curtains, I felt hollow, not angry, not shocked, just empty. He was asleep on the floor when I finally opened the door. He looked small, then older than I had ever seen him. For a moment I felt something close to pity, and I hated myself for it. The days that followed were worse than the discovery. I moved through the house like a guest, afraid to touch anything. Every object carried memory. Every corner echoed with the life I thought I had. Walter followed me quietly, offering coffee, food, apologies, promises. I ignored most of them. At night I stared at the ceiling, wondering how a marriage could survive decades only to collapse without noise. I thought of Evan constantly. I imagined his face if he knew. The anger, the shame, the destruction. I imagined his life breaking in two the way mine already had. I told myself that telling the truth would destroy him and that silence might save him. I do not know when love became fear or when protection turned into betrayal, but somewhere in those days I chose him over myself.
Walter begged again and again.
He promised therapy, church, honesty, distance, anything I asked. He swore he would never see Claire again. He said he would sell the house if I wanted, move away, disappear. I listened without responding until one evening I saw our old family photograph still hanging crooked on the wall.
3 smiles frozen in time, unaware of the rot beneath them. Something inside me gave up.
I told him I would stay. Not because I believed him. Not because I forgave him. But because I was tired and afraid of what truth would cost our son. I set rules.
Absolute silence.
No contact. No excuses. He agreed, instantly grasping at my decision like a lifeline. That night I lay beside him without touching. I stared into the dark and told myself this was strength. I told myself this was sacrifice. I told myself peace could be rebuilt on quiet lies. I was wrong again. Time moved forward the way it always does without asking permission from grief. Weeks passed, then months, and from the outside our lives appeared almost normal again. Walter kept his promises, at least the visible ones. He stayed home more. He spoke softly. He watched me constantly, as if measuring every breath, afraid I might vanish or explode. I answered him when necessary and ignored him when I could. We became 2 people sharing space rather than a marriage sharing warmth. Claire stopped visiting altogether. When we crossed paths by chance, she kept her eyes lowered, her voice thin and formal. I felt nothing toward her that I could name clearly.
Not rage, not hatred, not forgiveness.
She was simply part of a memory I tried not to touch because touching it still burned. Evan came home one evening brighter than I had seen him in years. He burst through the door talking before he even took off his jacket, his face alive with excitement. He said Claire was pregnant. He said the doctor confirmed it that afternoon. He said he could hardly believe it after all those years of disappointment and tests and quiet sadness. His joy filled the room like light spilling through a window. Walter stood up so quickly his chair scraped the floor. He smiled wide, too wide, and reached for Evan's shoulder, congratulating him, laughing in a voice that sounded unfamiliar to me. When he took the ultrasound paper, his hands shook. He stared at it longer than necessary, then folded it carefully as if it were something fragile and dangerous. He did not look at me.
I sat there holding my hands together until my fingers ached. My mind counted without my permission.
Months, weeks, days. Evan had been gone often during that time. Walter had not. The numbers aligned too easily. A cold sensation spread through my chest, tightening my breath. That night we celebrated with dinner. Evan spoke endlessly about names, schools, the future. Claire smiled, but her eyes drifted again and again toward Walter, then quickly away. I watched every movement, every pause, every swallowed word. No one noticed the storm growing quietly inside me. Later, when the house was quiet, I stood alone in the kitchen staring at the dark window. The reflection looking back at me seemed older, thinner, edged with something sharp. I realized then that the truth I buried had not stayed buried. It had grown roots. And now something new was forming above ground, something that would force its way into the light, whether I was ready or not. I went to bed without sleep, listening to Walter breathe beside me. For the first time since the discovery, I felt fear stronger than grief. Not fear of betrayal, not fear of loss, but fear of what was coming next. Because joy like that, when it arrives at the wrong time, does not bring blessings. It brings reckoning. The months that followed were the longest of my life, not because time slowed, but because every day demanded that I pretend. I cooked meals, I smiled when spoken to, I asked Claire how she was feeling, and listened as she described cravings and doctor visits. My hands moved automatically seasoning soups, folding laundry, wiping counters, while my mind lived somewhere else, entirely trapped between memory and suspicion. I told myself that doubt was cruel, that I was poisoning my own soul with thoughts I had no right to confirm. Yet each time I looked at Walter, I saw the way his eyes lingered on Claire's growing belly, with something too complex to be pried alone. When the baby was born, Evan called us in tears. He sounded younger than he had in years, overwhelmed with joy and relief. A healthy boy, he said, perfect fingers, perfect lungs, perfect life. At the hospital, I held the child, briefly, careful, gentle, doing everything an ordinary grandmother would do. I told everyone he was beautiful, and in that moment I believed it. But beauty does not erase truth. Back home after the celebration, quiet returned, and with it the voice inside me that refused to rest. I noticed things I wished I could unsee. The baby's nose sharp and familiar. The crease at the corner of his eyes identical to Walter's when he squinted in the sun. I tried to convince myself that families share features, that imagination creates patterns where none exist. Still the fear pressed closer each day. One afternoon when the house was empty and my hands would not stop shaking, I made my decision. I did not feel brave. I felt cornered. I gathered a soft brush from the bathroom and a tiny envelope from my sewing drawer. When I visited Evan and Claire later that week, I waited until everyone stepped outside to take a call. Alone in the nursery, I stood over the crib, listening to the baby's quiet breathing. I whispered an apology, though I did not know to whom. I took a few strands of hair, so gently the child did not stir. At home I found strands of Walter's hair caught in his brush just as easily. That detail nearly broke me. Evidence had always been there waiting. The clinic was small and anonymous. I told the receptionist I was helping with family records. She did not ask questions. The waiting period felt endless. I walked parks, I sat on benches, I watched strangers live ordinary lives, unaware that my world was balancing on a single envelope. When the call finally came, my legs nearly gave out. I asked them to mail the results. I could not bear to hear the words spoken aloud. I opened the envelope alone, sitting in my car, hands stiff, breath shallow. The language was clinical, detached, merciless. Probability, confirmation, certainty. There was no room for doubt. The child was Walter's son, not Evan's. I stared at the paper until the letters blurred. I felt no tears, no scream, no anger, only a deep hollow spreading through my chest, as if something vital had been removed without anesthesia. The betrayal had crossed a line that could never be named without destroying everything it touched. I folded the paper slowly, placed it back inside the envelope, and sat there until the sun began to set. In that moment, I understood that silence had not saved my family. It had only delayed the damage. And now the truth lived inside me alone, heavier than any burden I had ever carried. I did not go home after that. I drove without direction, letting traffic lights decide for me, turning left when the road curved left, stopping only when my hands cramped around the steering wheel. The paper with the truth stayed folded in my coat pocket, heavy as stone. Every sound felt distant, as if I were moving underwater. Faces passed me, strangers living lives untouched by what I carried, and I envied them with a bitterness I had never known. Thoughts came in fragments, not sentences. Evan laughing as a child, running through sprinklers. Walter holding my hand at our wedding, promising a lifetime that now felt like a cruel joke. Claire standing in my kitchen, thanking me for soup with eyes that never quite met mine. The baby's small fingers curling instinctively around mine, searching for comfort from someone who knew too much. At some point I left the car and walked. Streets blurred into one another. My feet hurt, but pain felt necessary proof that I still existed. I spoke aloud without realizing it, whispering questions to no one, asking what kind of mother allows this, what kind of wife survives it, what kind of God watches silently. Night came, and with it a strange calm. My thoughts slowed, then loosened, then scattered. Reality softened at the edges. I sat on a bench and watched shadows stretch across the pavement, and for the first time since learning the truth, I felt relief. Not peace, but absence. Absence of responsibility, absence of choice. Someone must have called the police, or maybe Evan had been searching for hours when he finally found me. I remember his voice breaking when he said my name the way it sounded when he was a boy afraid of the dark. He knelt in front of me, holding my shoulders, asking where I had been, asking what happened, asking why I would not answer. I looked at him and smiled because in that moment he was still safe. He did not know. He could not know. My mind reached for the only shelter left and pulled it over me like a blanket. I told him the baby was sleeping and that we must not wake him.
I cradled nothing in my arms and rocked gently, humming a lullaby my mother once sang to me.
They took me home later, or perhaps somewhere else, I no longer remember clearly. Doctors spoke. Words like shock and trauma floated past me without meaning. I learned quickly that if I stayed in this quiet fog, no one would demand answers. No one would make me choose between destroying my son or carrying the truth until it crushed me completely. Madness was not sudden. It was gradual and kind. It softened the sharp edges of memory, blurred the faces, rearranged the story into something survivable. In this version, I am only a grandmother waiting, watching, protecting a child who must sleep peacefully. If you are hearing this now, it means part of me remained awake long enough to speak. Long enough to leave behind what my silence could not save. Because some truths are too heavy for a single mind, and some lives pay the price when love chooses to endure what should never be endured.